Someone make it make sense.
Probably a couple.
Hello, did everyone get transported over here through the magic of science and technology, or maybe not science, maybe just technology? Shout out to Rochelle, happy to see you. And so hopefully anybody who didn't get shuttled on over will figure it out by just, clicking on it. But we are back, so we're going to watch, and they're not long. Some opening statements are long. These are not long. So I just thought it'd be a fun way to sort of finish out this whole discussion about what is it going to be like at Donna's trial, especially after seeing her take the stand today twice. So we are going to watch, and again, we haven't done this. We haven't watched these yet on this channel. I mean, I watched it at the time, but anyway, so it was overdue anyway. So we're going to watch the opening statements, and we'll start with the state. And by the way, Sarah Dugan gives the opening statements in this trial, who we just heard from today from the bond hearing. And we also heard from recently too, when we were watching Katie's cross exam. So we're seeing a lot of Sarah lately here. So here we go.
Thank y'all for being here with us today. I know that we've been introduced, but y'all haven't heard from me yet. My name is Sarah Catherine Dugan, and I'm going to be representing the state of Florida in this case, along with Georgia Kappelman. The last couple of days, we've obviously been in jury selection. Thank y'all for your patience with that. I know there's a lot of waiting involved with
that green.
In jury selection, each side was able to kind of talk with you about your feelings and concepts. Your feelings about the law and different concepts. But now it's time for opening statements, where each of us is going to kind of give you a roadmap of what we expect that the evidence in this case will show.
She had high hopes. She said each of us, as in she's also referencing the defense. You guys just wait for that. Oh my God. So we're going to see the state's roadmap, right? We're going to see the state's roadmap, and then we're going to see what happens with the defense.
And then after opening statements, you'll start hearing from witnesses and getting into the actual evidence in this case. So let's get right to it. The reason that we're here today is because the defendant in this case, Charlie Adelson, hired a hitman to kill his former brother-in-law, Dan Markel. This murder was set into motion because back in 2014,
he mouthed that's not true. Love it.
The defendant's family, the Adelson family, had a big problem. And that big problem was Dan Markel. And the solution to that problem was this defendant. This defendant was the solution to that problem because he had a girlfriend with connections to the type of people who were willing and capable of pointing a gun at a complete stranger and pulling the trigger. The victim in this case was known as Danny to his friends and family. He was a loving father to two little boys. He was a highly respected professor at Florida State College of Law. And tragically, on July 18th of 2014, Dan Markel was shot twice in the head in broad daylight in the driveway of his home in the Benton Hills neighborhood here in Tallahassee. The last day of Dan Markel's life that day began like any other of his mornings that summer. He woke up, he drove his two little boys to preschool and dropped them off, and then he drove over to the gym to work out. After finishing his workout, he returned home. He pulled in his driveway, opened his garage, but little did he know that throughout his just normal routine that morning, he was being followed. He was being followed by two hired hitmen who traveled all the way from Miami to Tallahassee for the sole purpose of murdering him. And just like something out of a horror movie, he pulls into his driveway, and the car, that unknown to him, pulls in right behind him. Moments later, Dan Markel's neighbor heard a gunshot. He looked out the window and he saw a light-colored Toyota Prius backing quickly out of Dan Markel's driveway and then speeding away. The neighbor waited for a couple minutes to see if maybe Dan Markel came out of his house or back out of his driveway too. And when nothing happened, this neighbor got that funny feeling that maybe something could be wrong here. So he walked over, and what he found was a gruesome scene. He walked in the garage and saw that the driver's side window of Dan Markel's car was shattered. He saw Dan Markel was still behind the wheel. He was alive, but he was moaning, he was unresponsive, and he was terribly injured.
Awful.
The neighbor then goes and calls 911. Law enforcement arrives, and they find Dan Markel unresponsive with gunshot wounds to his head. He was then taken to the hospital, where he survived for several hours before he was actually pronounced dead. Dan Markel was 41 years old, and his little boys that were deprived of their father that day were just 3 and 4 years old. Law enforcement immediately began to investigate to figure out who shot Dan Markel. And the evidence they find sets them down two separate paths. One path is that they had to track down that light-colored Prius that the neighbors saw fleeing from the crime scene and identify who was inside that Prius. And the other path relates to Dan Markel's personal life. They looked to see who, if anybody, in Dan Markel's personal life would hate Dan Markel enough to kill him.
There she is.
And after years of tireless investigation by law enforcement, both of these two paths led directly to this defendant.
That is really well said. You know, and we always talk about how, like, what a great example of building a case, like a really strong case, and taking the time, right? And it did take time. But this was just a great way of explaining it, that they had these two paths. Like, let's listen to that again. That was really powerful. And just this is so clear and so linear. It's not dramatic. It's not appealing to emotion. I just really appreciate this.
To Dan Markel's personal life. They looked to see who, if anybody, in Dan Markel's personal life would hate Dan Markel enough to kill him. And after years of tireless investigation by law enforcement, both of these two paths led directly to this defendant.
Well done.
So
that was great.
Let's talk about the path involving Dan Markel's personal life first.
Oh, fine.
Who might have a motive to kill Dan Markel?
Okay, hang on. So who might have a motive? So also we have, I keep forgetting we've got this one that I added here.
It's very big. It's very big.
Yeah. So the
enforcement learned that Markel was entangled in a very nasty divorce with his ex-wife,
with the blunt force trauma binder
sister. Her name is Wendi Adelson. A review of their divorce case file revealed that Wendi Adelson asked the court to allow her to move back to Miami, where she was from, with the kids, in order to be near her parents, whose names are Harvey and Donna Adelson, and her brother, the defendant. Dan Markel was adamantly opposed to his children being relocated to Miami. He was a law professor here in Tallahassee. This is where he lived. This is where his kids have been raised. He wanted his kids to live here with him. And for this custody dispute, the judge ended up ruling in Dan Markel's favor. So Wendi Adelson was not permitted to move to Miami with the children. Unless, of course, something happened to Dan Markel. A review of Wendi Adelson's emails revealed that her mother, Donna Adelson, hated Dan Markel and was desperate to find a way for Wendi and her children, who were Donna Adelson's grandchildren, to be able to move to Miami. Donna Adelson suggests in these emails that y'all will hear about several ways that Wendi Adelson could threaten or bully Dan Markel into submission, into getting what she wanted him to do. Donna Adelson even suggested offering Dan Markel a $1 million bribe to allow the relocation, and even said that this defendant, Charlie Adelson, would pay a third of that $1 million bribe to Dan Markel to make that happen. The evidence in this case will show that Donna Adelson's closest confidant was her son, the defendant. She and the defendant talked multiple times a day, every day. He was the person with whom she would constantly vent and complain to.
And what's really funny,
Wendy's situation.
Because remember, this is all being said before all the jail phone calls came out, because that was after he was convicted. So, you know, we know from the jail phone, like we've heard that, that they talked for hours and hours and hours every day. But it's just so funny. It's like that was true before he was arrested. He was a mama's boy.
The defendant was also the person that Donna Adelson relied on to solve her problems. And this was a big, big problem for Donna Adelson. And she made it the defendant's problem to solve.
Yep.
So the divorce between Wendi Adelson and Dan Markel was final about a year before the actual murder. But that was not the end of that case. Litigation was ongoing, to say the least. Each side would continue to routinely file violations of the custody agreement, violations of the settlement agreement, and that continued right up until Dan Markel's death in July of 2014.
Another thing I really like about her is she's really, her hand gestures really illustrate what she's saying. I feel like for a juror, this is, again, easy to follow, it's clear, and you're keeping their attention. So yeah.
This was a highly emotionally charged situation between them leading up to his death. However, there was no physical violence that Wendi Adelson needed to be rescued from or anything like that. But make no mistake, this was a very messy custody dispute. Shortly before the murder, in fact, Dan Markel, the victim, filed with the court and basically asked the court, he alleged that Donna Adelson was disparaging him to his children by saying bad things about him. And he asked the court to enter an order preventing Donna Adelson from having unsupervised contact with her grandchildren. This motion was still pending in court when Dan Markel was killed. The murder of Dan Markel ensured that an adverse ruling on his motion would never be a problem for the Adelsons. And just about 48 hours after the shooting, Wendi, Adelson, and the little boys relocated to Miami. Shortly thereafter, moved into a home within walking distance of the Adelson's Miami home. Within a year of Dan Markel's murder, Wendi Adelson legally changed Dan Markel's son's last name from Markel to Adelson. And just like that, their father was just effectively erased from their lives at 3 and 4.
Awful.
And the Adelson's family, their big problem had been solved.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hear during this trial that the Adelsons are a very tight-knit family.
Yeah.
The defendant and his parents, Harvey and Donna Adelson, they actually even all worked together at the Adelson Institute, which was their family's dental practice. At the Adelson Institute, the defendant and Harvey Adelson were dentists, and Donna Adelson managed the office. After Dan Markel was killed on July 18, 2014, law enforcement interviewed Wendi Adelson. And Wendi Adelson acknowledged that her family had a motive to kill Dan Markel, or to want him dead. She admitted that her brother, the defendant, had even said that he looked into hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel as a divorce present to her.
Yeah.
But he decided to buy her a TV instead because it was cheaper. And coincidentally, or not, that TV that this defendant bought his sister as a divorce gift instead of hiring a hitman would be Wendi Adelson's alibi for the morning of the murder when the victim was killed by a hitman. So this path of looking into Dan Markel's life to see who would have a motive to want him dead leads law enforcement to the Adelsons, including this defendant, a man who told his family that he'd looked into hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel. The defense asked yesterday in jury selection, who's talked trash or heard somebody talk trash about an in-law, which is not a rare concept. A lot of people don't like their in-laws. But the difference here is that the defendant's comment stopped being just a little bit of trash talk when Dan Markel was actually killed by a hitman. While the police are trying to investigate, who in Dan Markel's personal life may have a motive to kill him, they're simultaneously going down that second path I described to y'all, which was tracking down the vehicle that the neighbor saw fleeing the crime scene. When law enforcement retraced Dan Markel's steps the morning of the murder, they uncovered some chilling surveillance video of a Prius fitting the description of the one seen by the neighbor, following Dan Markel into the Premier Gym parking lot, waiting for an hour while he was inside, and then following him home from Premier Gym back to his neighborhood. They got these surveillance images from city buses, from Premier, from everywhere they possibly could. And these surveillance images, coupled with a massive amount of phone data and SunPass records gathered in this case, helped police to eventually track down the exact car used in this crime. But police still had to figure out who was in the Prius and why did they kill Dan Markel. As part of this really painstaking review that law enforcement did of all of these records, and when I say painstaking, finding this Prius and finding all of this evidence and all of these records was not an easy task. And it took longer than your average investigation. It was very difficult to do. They combed through tons of phone records and even did what's called a tower dump, which is where law enforcement collected a list of all of the cell phone numbers that communicated with the cell tower that serviced different spots in Tallahassee that Dan Markel was at that morning, including Premier Gym, when the suspect's Prius were there. Because they thought if the person in the Prius was using their phone at the time, then their number will be somewhere in this tower dump. They combed through all of that data and they found a number with a Miami area code belonging to a man named Sigfredo Garcia. Law enforcement examined all of Garcia's call logs and saw that he was in frequent contact with another number that was also present at Premier Gym that morning. And that number belonged to a man named Luis Rivera. Luis Rivera is a lifelong friend of Sigfredo Garcia and is also from Miami. Police then looked at all of Garcia and Rivera's phone records, which showed that their phones left Miami about 2 days before this murder on July 16th of 2014. The phones came to Tallahassee, and on the day of the murder, July 18th, they followed Markel to Premier Gym. The phone data is consistent with both men turning off their phones just minutes before the murder and leaving their phones off until about an hour or so after the murder when they're well on their way back towards Miami. And then a bank's ATM camera caught both Garcia and Rivera in that light-colored Prius once they arrived back in the Miami area when they stopped at an ATM. So, police figured out the identity, and this should appear on the screens in front of you, the identity of the two men responsible for following and killing Dan Markel. Luis Rivera, his nickname is Tato, and Sigfredo Garcia, his nickname is Tudo. But they continued to look for evidence of why two seemingly random men came all the way to Tallahassee to kill a man, Dan Markel, that they'd never met. What or who is the connection between these killers and the victim? Well, phone records reveal that one of Sigfredo Garcia's most frequent contacts was a woman named Catherine McManua. Her nickname is Katie. Garcia and Catherine McManua have a long history.
There we go. I think this is a different visual aid than the one we've looked at before, I think. But this is helpful. I'm going to take a screenshot of that because we had a different one we were using. I think they were rearranged. I'm sure whoever it is whose trial will be in the middle, right? So, yeah, the one that we had looked at before had the hitmen like in the middle. This makes way more sense, I think. Now, of course, at Donna's trial, it'll be different, and it'll be different at Wendy's as well. But I'm going to go and just take a screenshot of this so that we can use this whenever we've got new people who are like, who are all these crazy Adelson people, right? You guys remember when y'all were like that? If you were, because some people weren't familiar with the case. Isn't it funny to think back on like when it was like, who are all these people? Now it's like some of you guys are like, basically could be like OG, like, followers of the case. But anyway, that's what happens when you start diving into this case, right? So.
History of an on-again, off-again relationship over the course of many years, and they actually share 2 kids in common. And lo and behold, when looking at the phone records, Catherine McManua is also one of the most frequent contacts of this defendant, Charlie Adelson. Law enforcement learned that at the time of Dan Martel's murder, this defendant was dating Catherine McManua. She was his girlfriend at the time. So Dan Martel was a problem that this defendant needed to solve for his family. The defendant was looking to hire a hitman to kill Dan Martel. Dan Martel ends up being killed by a hitman. And who ended up being the hitman? It was someone with a close relationship to this defendant's girlfriend. The hitman was the father of his girlfriend's children. So you can see how both leads in this case, followed by investigators, both of them charted paths to this defendant. Not only did looking into the motive lead law enforcement to the defendant because he wanted to hire someone to kill Dan Martel, but looking into the car, fleeing the scene, also led law enforcement to the defendant through his girlfriend at the time. So 2 different investigations arriving at the same conclusion. Law enforcement also tried to follow the money in this case. And that was a third way that the evidence in this case points to this defendant. Law enforcement reviewed bank records, employment records, DHS and V records. Sigfredo Garcia, Luis Rivera, and Catherine McManua all acquired some big ticket items. Rivera and Garcia both bought motorcycles and cars. Catherine McManua got a breast augmentation surgery and later received a black Lexus sedan whose previous owner was Harvey. Catherine McManua's bank records were analyzed, and there was no check ever written or matching cash withdrawal for the car or the breast augmentation, which was paid for in cash. Bank records also showed that Catherine McManua's account had a huge spike in cash deposits right around the time of the murder. She deposited more money.
This is especially awesome because we just watched Katie's testimony. And remember when we saw that exhibit with the spike where it said murder? Remember, guys, how insane that was? Literally. And she's referencing it. This is great.
Her account in the 5 weeks following the murder than in the entire previous year before the murder. This was during a time when there was no record of her being employed anywhere. Also, about 2 months after the murder, the defendant added Catherine McManua to the payroll at the Adelson Institute. And she began receiving regular checks from their business account every 2 weeks for 2 years after the murder. And this was despite the fact that she did not work at the Adelson Institute. So the money was talking, but what were the suspects saying? That's what law enforcement wanted to know. So as they're examining the phone records in this case, they see a distinct pattern surrounding important events and dates in this case. The phone calls, and they can't see the content, they can't hear the content of these calls in these phone records, but they see that the calls are occurring. And the phone calls always went from Donna Adelson to the defendant, then from the defendant to Catherine McManua, then from Catherine McManua to Sigfredo Garcia, and back the other way. Kind of like train cars, they only touch the car right in front of them. Donna Adelson never calls Catherine McManua or Sigfredo Garcia.
Right.
Charlie Adelson never calls Sigfredo Garcia or vice versa. So if this is a murder for hire, as law enforcement suspects, could it be that the defendant was wisely insulating himself from the actual shooters by having Catherine McBanois act as a middleman between them. Law enforcement decided to launch an undercover investigation designed to clarify who the members of the conspiracy were and how information traveled within this conspiracy. People. So police applied for and received court authorization to listen in real time to the phone calls of the defendant and Catherine McBanois. And this is what's known as a wiretap. By this point, the point that the law enforcement received authorization to do this wiretap, it was April of 2016. So it's been not quite, but almost 2 years since the murder of Dan Markel, which occurred in July of 2014. So by April of 2016, the defendant and Catherine McBanois are no longer dating at that point. They've been broken up since the fall of 2014. Catherine McBanois is actually back together with Sigfredo Garcia, the father of her children, at that point. The defendant has moved on to many other girlfriends since Catherine McBanois. But the defendant and Catherine McBanois are still in regular communication and have remained very close friends since the murder. And Rivera, who was the second hitman in that Prius, he, in April of 2016, was actually in federal prison doing time on another charge unrelated to this murder. So all of the members of this conspiracy have presumably gone on with their lives, believing they've gotten away with this murder. So even though law enforcement has authority to listen to their calls now, what reason would these people have to still be discussing the murder at this point? So police needed to stage an event that would generate conversation between the conspirators about the murder. And the plan was to send an undercover agent posing as somebody on behalf of Luis Rivera, who was incarcerated, to walk up to Donna Adelson on the street and try to extort money out of her. And law enforcement refers to this as the bump. So this undercover agent walks up to Donna Adelson one day as she's leaving the Adelson Institute during the day. The undercover agent hands Donna Adelson a piece of paper. And on the piece of paper is an article about the murder of Dan Markel with his picture on it and, FSU professor killed. Also on the piece of paper are a phone number and the amount of $5,000. The undercover agent tells Donna Adelson that he knows that the Adelsons are taking care of Katie, and he's there to extort money out of her on Rivera's behalf in order to even things out. The undercover agent never says the defendant's name or anything about the defendant's involvement to Donna Adelson. Then law enforcement listens to see what will happen next. Will Donna Adelson go straight to the police to report this extortion attempt, or will something else entirely happen? As suspected, based on the previously observed communication pattern, the first person that Donna Adelson calls after the bump is the defendant, despite the fact that the undercover agent never mentioned the defendant to her. On that first call, one would think that Donna Adelson would say to her son, it's so crazy. Some man came up to me and he's handed me this article about Danny's murder, and he's seems like he's demanding money from us.
Isn't it interesting too that when they did the bump, they didn't approach Charlie, they approached Donna, right? I find that really interesting. I mean, that really does put Donna at, that is a huge thing against her, right? It's really fascinating how they went about that, and then she contacted Charlie versus the other way around.
She never says any of that. In fact, she never says Dan Markel's name at all. Instead, she tells the defendant that she needs to talk to him in person, not over the phone, about some paperwork that was hand-delivered to her. She said that this paperwork, she says this to the defendant, it involves the two of us.
Just
and
the two of us.
That he should know what she's talking about. She says that he should bring cash to their meeting. And she also says that this TV is about 5.
Oh my God.
Donna Adelson tells the defendant that the man who approached her mentioned an ex-girlfriend. Donna Adelson never says which ex-girlfriend she's referring to. She never says Catherine McBanois or Katie's name to the defendant in that phone call. She only says that the blackmailer mentioned an ex-girlfriend. The defendant never asks his mom, whose ex-girlfriend? My ex-girlfriend? Which ex-girlfriend?
Right. And that's why it matters that he had all these different girlfriends, right? Because it's like he knew which one.
He never asked that. Because as the evidence will show, he didn't need to. He knew that this TV is about 5, meant that she was being blackmailed about Danny's murder for $5,000. And he knew that the ex-girlfriend in question was Catherine McBanois. And we know that because after this call with his mother, who is the defendant? The defendant calls Catherine McBanois. He doesn't call his most recent ex-girlfriend. He doesn't even call the most recent ex-girlfriend before the most recent ex-girlfriend, the one before that. No, he calls Catherine McBanois.
June.
And his call to Catherine McBanois is the only call that he makes to any ex-girlfriend. after getting the information from his mother that the blackmailer mentioned an ex-girlfriend. And he had not dated Catherine McBanwell for 1.5 years at that point.
Yeah.
And although the defendant threatens to do it often, neither he nor his mom ever report the matter to the police. The only people that he discusses it with on these calls is Donna Adelson and Catherine McBanwell. And you'll hear these phone calls between the conspirators. And as you listen to these calls, y'all will notice that they are being cautious about what they say over the phone. It's very apparent that they are very careful with their words because they are immediately suspicious that law enforcement could be listening to their conversations. So Donna Adelson calls the defendant, and the defendant's first call is to Catherine McBanwell. After that, the defendant then meets up with his mom in person, like his mom requested. And his mom gives him this paperwork that the undercover agent gave her. Then next, the defendant and Catherine McBanwell meet up in person. And they meet up at a restaurant in Miami called Dolce Vita.
Dolce Vita.
And while they sat at their table.
So y'all that were there when we were watching Katie's the other day, remember they played that video and it was like, where is this camera set up? Is it attached with gum? This is the Dolce Vita video.
And this Dolce Vita is a busy, noisy restaurant. An undercover FBI agent sat at a table nearby with a hidden camera in their bag and recorded this conversation. And in the recording, we hear the defendant discussing whether the man who walked up to his mom could be an undercover police officer or someone who's trying to blackmail them. And if it's the latter, if it's a blackmailer, is it somebody who's just trying to make a quick buck? Or is it somebody who actually knows information from the inside?
Incredible.
The defendant reassures Catherine McBanwell that if it is the police, that's a good thing. The defendant thinks that if it's the police, that means that they do not have enough evidence to charge anybody. In fact, the defendant tells her, if they had any evidence, we would have already gone to the airport. The defendant starts giving her some legal advice. He says that, hey, in order to prove that someone committed a crime, you have to be able to put the person at the scene of the crime at the time it was committed.
Oh my God.
Which, unfortunately for them, is not an accurate statement of the law.
Sorry. It's just funny because like John being like, again, I'm not an attorney. And it's like, yeah, like here's Charlie giving legal advice that's incorrect, right?
It's important to note, too, at the time of this conversation at Dolce Vita, no arrests had been made. The only thing that police had released to the public was a photo of the Prius that fled the scene. This was the Prius that Garcia and Rivera rented and used the day of Dan Martel's murder. So police knew at that point that it was Garcia and Rivera who were in the Prius, but the public did not know that yet, and no arrests had been made because they wanted to do this undercover investigation. And so the fact that this photo of this Prius had been released to the public is interesting in light of some of the things that y'all will hear the defendant say to Catherine McBanwell in the Dolce Vita recording. He starts giving Catherine McBanwell several analogies, all involving rental cars used to commit crimes. He reassures her that, hey, if DNA is found in a car, all that means is that at one
These are the different scenarios we heard Katie talk about. That's so funny.
point, the person sat in the car. And if that car was later used in a crime, police can't prove that just from a person's DNA being in the car. The defendant points out to her that if a rental car is found that was at a crime scene, police also have to prove who was driving it at the time. He gives her a very relevant hypothetical.
Amazing.
Of her renting a car in Miami and someone asking to borrow it and driving to Orlando to commit a robbery, and how she would be innocent in that hypothetical because she wasn't in the car at the time of the robbery. So through these analogies, the defendant is reassuring Catherine McBanwell that even if police identify who rented the car that fled the scene, they still would not have enough evidence to hold anybody responsible for the murder, even if they did find out it was Garcia and Rivera. The defendant also says that crimes are tough to prove unless someone actually witnessed the suspect commit a crime, or a suspect makes a confession, or a suspect is caught on a wire talking about the crime. So the defendant's trying to reassure her about the lack of
literally what, dude, this is amazing.
evidence. And hey, as long as we all stay quiet, then we don't have anything to worry about. At one point, the defendant asked her, let me ask you a question. And then he asked her about money. He says, when everybody was there the next day, did you take any money? Like, are any of you driving around in a Bentley? Or no, it's not like any of you are driving around in a Bentley or cruising around in a mega yacht. So here the defendant's pointing out that the money wasn't used to buy anything flashy that would draw the attention of the police. And when discussing, and you all will hear during the course of this trial why his statement or his question about the money from the next day is particularly important. The evidence will show that Catherine McBanwell went to the defendant's home the night of the murder, where he paid her in cash. And the next day, Catherine McBanwell paid Garcia and Rivera their cuts of the money. Mm-hmm. When discussing the possibility of whether this is actually some gangster trying to blackmail his family for money, the defendant says that whoever this person is, whoever it is, knows information. The defendant told Catherine McBanwell that there are two ways of dealing with this guy. They could call the police, but then the guy blackmailing them would be charged with trying to blackmail his family. And the blackmailer would start talking, and he would start calling out Catherine McVanois' name. And then police are going to be asking questions about what happened. The other option is to pay the blackmailer, but let him know that this is a one-time thing, and try to scare the blackmailer off.
It's a
by
one-time
saying,
thing.
hey, if you come around again, we're going to the police.
Oh my God.
So the defendant then gives Catherine McVanois very precise instructions. He wants her to call the blackmailer and tell him that, this would be what he wants Catherine McVanois to say. My friends, meaning the Adelson family, have no idea what you're talking about. And I don't have any idea what you're talking about either. But the name of the person who you said is incarcerated sounds familiar. So I'm going to give you this money as charity to help the less fortunate. But don't contact these people again, or they're going to go to the police.
You guys, you can't make this shit up. They're going to give the money away as a charity to someone less fortunate. To somebody who's incarcerated, just to try to make it look like it's not. They're not responding to the blackmail. I mean, brilliant. It's just brilliant.
And the defendant said he would give Catherine McVanois the $5,000 to pay off the blackmailer, except he's concerned, though, that this won't resolve the issue for good. The defendant is worried that this guy is not going to go away, that he's going to keep coming back for more and more money. And the defendant offers a solution to have this blackmailer killed. And he says he's willing to pay whatever it takes. The defendant tells her that, this is the defendant talking to Catherine McVanois, this guy, meaning the blackmailer, is effing with him and his wife. And you better kill him or he's going to be a big problem because he knows who you are. And the defendant then says, if he can't handle this, I'll have somebody else do it. The defendant says, so help me God, if they fuck with my family, it's going to be Nazi shit because this will be done. I mean, Katie, I don't care what I spend. It's important to note during this conversation and the entire wiretap, the defendant never says Sigfredo Garcia's name. But the evidence will show that the defendant was talking about Sigfredo Garcia when the defendant says that the blackmailer was effing with him and his wife. And if he can't do it, I'll find someone else who will. Because immediately after that, the defendant checks with Catherine McVanois to make sure that Garcia has no hard feelings towards him, no reason not to help him. He says, hey, I have you on salary. You think he'd be happy about that? And he also says, I mean, our paths never crossed, meaning, hey, Garcia wasn't in the picture when he and Catherine McVanois were together. There wasn't any overlap. After hearing that the defendant wants someone killed and is willing to pay whatever it takes to get it done, Catherine McVanois then asks the defendant to help her out. And the defendant reassures her that she'll be taken care of by saying, he says, I don't have to. Sometimes the chairs can be a little wobbly. I know this is taking a bit, but I'm almost done. Thank y'all for being patient. All right, so she asks him to help her out. And the defendant reassures her that she'll be taken care of. He says he doesn't have to tell her the things that he'll do for her. He shows her what he'll do for her. She doesn't have to ask him for anything. He looks for things to do. He says, hey, when someone's birthday's coming up or there's car problems, she doesn't have to ask. He looks for ways to help. And after his meeting with Catherine McVanois, the defendant immediately calls Donna Adelson to let her know that everything's fine. And he does this using some pretty obvious code words, which y'all will hear. And you'll hear the conspirators often use words to mask the meaning of what they're actually talking about. Catherine McVanois then, also using these code words, tasked Garcia with calling the number on the paperwork and finding out if a blackmailer is a legitimate associate of Rivera or not. And in a series of recorded calls that follow, you guys are going to hear these conspirators talking and using words like TV, false leads, listings, properties, clients, rap songs, CDs, potbelly pigs, relationship advice, all these different terms that are normal terms any of us may use, but they're used in context in these calls that if you're listening to the conversation, do not make any sense. For example, in the calls, the defendant and Catherine McVanois don't outright debate the pros and cons of whether they should pay this blackmailer. Instead, they talk about the fact that this property is cheap. They might expect a property like this to even be $1 million. This property seems like a great deal, but if you get the wrong tenant in there, the tenant may keep increasing the rent, and that tenant may become a leash that never leaves you. So it will be up to y'all to decide whether this defendant is actually worried about a future tenant of a property that might raise the rent and pay him more money, or if the defendant is actually worried that if he pays off the blackmailer, then the blackmailer may continue to come back again and again, or send a cousin or a friend to become a leash that never leaves him, that he can't get rid of. In another of these calls, the defendant tells Catherine McVanois that whoever this person is, this blackmailer is, he's got a lot of effing details. And in another, they discuss the fact that this blackmailer is not from the inside. And the defendant says that this guy is probably not from the first layer.
And it's like, Jesus Christ.
But the second layer. So not someone who got info from Garcia, but maybe somebody who got info from Rivera. But one fact, and let me just say, as the jury, you all will interpret and decide what they're really talking about. in these calls. Only y'all can determine the meaning and the weight to give this evidence, and only you can separate just mere coincidences from evidence in a conspiracy. But one fact, though, is really clear throughout these calls, is that all of these conspirators are hopeful that this blackmailer is law enforcement just trying to get information, because they think if it's law enforcement and the police don't have enough to bring charges, just fishing for information versus the other possibility, which would obviously be much worse for them, that the Adelsons are being blackmailed by somebody who actually knows inside information about their roles in Dan Markel's murder and may tell the police what they know. So after this undercover operation, which was in 2016, Luis Rivera, Sigfredo Garcia, and Catherine McManua are arrested. They're charged with the same charges before y'all in this trial. And Luis Rivera ended up cutting a deal with the state to tell law enforcement the truth about the murder of Dan Markel and the people responsible. Rivera told law enforcement that he was hired by Sigfredo Garcia to help kill Dan Markel. And Rivera described how Garcia told him that Catherine McManua, the mother of Garcia's children, secured this job for them. And the job was in Tallahassee, and it paid $100,000, with Rivera's being about a third of it, $35,000. Rivera explained that he and Garcia actually made 2 trips to Tallahassee with the intent of killing Dan Markel. The first one was a month before the murder. It was in June of 2014. And the second was when Dan Markel was actually killed in July of 2014. Rivera said that he bought a gun off the street for that second trip, and Garcia rented a car. I'm sorry, for the June trip. Rivera bought a gun off the street, and Garcia rented a car for that trip. Garcia and Rivera did some scouting on that trip of Dan Markel's residence, some surveillance, but ultimately couldn't get the job done. They ended heading back to Miami. During the trip to Tallahassee, he said that Garcia had a piece of paper with a picture of the man that they were supposed to kill on it, and some handwritten notes as well. Cell phone records corroborated Rivera's information about the June trip. Rivera also told a story about an incident in Tallahassee where he and Garcia were riding down the road in the rented Prius, and Garcia accidentally discharged the murder weapon, and the bullet struck the floorboard of the Prius. Law enforcement tracked down that actual Prius again and were able to see evidence in the undercarriage that corroborated Rivera's information about the accidental discharge. So they're looking at the phone evidence, they're trying to find whatever they can to kind of corroborate what he's telling them. I mentioned earlier that both men, Garcia and Rivera, cut their phones off from the time that they left Premiere and kept them off until well after the murder when they're on their way back home. Rivera said that the first call that either of them made after the homicide was from Garcia to McManua, where Garcia told her that the job was done. And McManua assured them that they would get their money the next day, which they did. Rivera says when Catherine McManua brought cash to him at his home. And all this information that Luis Rivera provided them was corroborated by, including when the money was dropped off, was corroborated by cell phone records in this case. Well, Luis Rivera told police that the next day after the murder, he was paid in cash by Catherine McManua, and that the money was packaged in a very unusual way. Here we go. The money was in stacks of $100 bills, and the money was stapled together. The stacks of 100s, every $1,000 was stapled together. During this trial, y'all will hear that the defendant had access to a lot of cash, and nothing's wrong with that. He had a lot of cash because his family gives cash discounts at their dental practice, and he keeps the cash that he receives in a safe. Again, nothing wrong about that either. However, what is relevant in this case is that the defendant had a very unusual practice of keeping the cash in his safe in $1,000 stacks of $100 bills that were stapled together, just like the money Luis Rivera received. Over the last few years, since the 2016 arrests and interview of Luis Rivera, law enforcement has not stopped working on this case. There were trials in 2019 and 2022, so right before the pandemic and right after the pandemic, of co-conspirators. Law enforcement also continued to try to gather all the evidence that they possibly could. They continued to interview people who may possibly have any information about the case. They tried to clarify any audio recordings that couldn't be clearly heard. While the phone wiretaps are very clear, the wiretap conversations that took place in public places when these people were meeting in person were not clearly audible back in 2016. Some still aren't, but because these public places are often too noisy. For instance, the recording of the conversation between the defendant and Catherine McManua and Dolce Vita had too much background noise to be able to clearly hear what the conspirators were talking about. However, since 2016, as technology developed over the years, and thanks to law enforcement's just continued dedication, law enforcement eventually found an expert that was formerly employed by the CIA with improved technology and enough expertise to clarify this recording at Dolce Vita that y'all will hear. And he did that by being able to reduce as much background noise as possible. And once this recording was clarified, which was actually just early last year in 2022, the state arrested this defendant.
Crazy.
The presentation of this evidence, as y'all can see from opening, it's a lot. It's a lot of information. It's going to take a little bit of time, and it may be tedious at times. And I want to thank y'all in advance for the careful attention to all of the evidence y'all see in here during this trial. When you'll see that this defendant carried out his plan to hire a hitman to kill Dan Martel. He conspired and he solicited Catherine McManois to get this murder done, and he paid her for the job once it was completed. This defendant acted in furtherance of this murder plot that went beyond just thinking about it or talking about it. And these acts make him guilty as a principal to first-degree murder, just as if he pulled the trigger himself. While the defendant's choices helped solve a problem within his family, they came at a very high price. He took the life of a loving father of 2 little boys, and he caused a lifetime of grief for Dan Martel's loved ones. Y'all heard a lot in jury selection about how important this trial is to the defendant, which I'm sure it is. But Dan Martel was loved. He was a brother. He was a son. And this trial is his family's opportunity to see justice done for the person who set up their son's murder. And at the conclusion of this evidence, y'all will be convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty. And at that point, we'll ask you for the only verdict that does justice in this case, which is a verdict that the defendant is guilty as charged. Thank y'all.
Well done. Well done.
Defense prepared to give us something second.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, here we go. Double extortion time, guys.
Judge, we just need one moment to fix the light.
Go ahead.
Get ready to be confused.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Of course. George Olsby meddling and shit. He's getting the Elmo.
Proceed, Your Honor.
Okay.
Good morning. I didn't get to talk to you that much the last couple of days. My name is Dan Rashbaum, and with me is Kate Myers, and we represent Charlie Adelson. Now let me start by saying the obvious. The murder of Professor Markel was a tragedy. The world lost a brilliant legal mind. His family lost a son and a brother. This community lost its sense of security and lost a good citizen. And his 2 boys, the nephews of Charlie Adelson, lost a loving father. His senseless murder continues to be felt throughout this community and others. It was inexcusable, despicable, evil. But what I'm going to tell you today is what actually happened. You will see that Charlie Adelson had nothing to do with the murder of Professor Markel. You will see that the state cannot come close to meeting its verdict. Why? Because Charlie Adelson is innocent. Now, I don't have to prove innocence. What I'm telling you, I very rarely say in a courtroom as a defense lawyer. Charlie Adelson is innocent. And we'll get there. But the next thing I'm going to tell you, I also rarely say in a courtroom. And you may be surprised to hear this from a defense lawyer. I have great respect for the prosecutors and law enforcement on this case. I have admiration for their efforts after the murder of Professor Markel in trying to find out who did it. You will see that they spent countless man-hours, cell phone tower dumps, surveillance videos from a boatload of places, buses, cameras on the street. Great law enforcement activity. And it paid off. They got the 3 killers. They convicted them. Sigfredo Garcia, convicted for life. Luis Rivera, Catherine Magbanua, convicted for life. Problem is, as you just heard, the state saw no connection between these people and Professor Markel. So from the very outset, the state suspected the Adelsons, the family. You saw the chart. It wasn't limited to Charlie Adelson. Unindicted co-conspirators in this case, the state has said it. Wendi Adelson,
Yes.
Donna Adelson, Harvey Adelson. The state knew, as you heard, that Wendi Adelson and Professor Markel had gone through a brutal divorce. You're going to see it. But they couldn't find the connection. But then they had their aha moment. As you heard, they determined that at the time of the murder in 2014, Charlie Adelson was dating Catherine Magbanua. And they learned that Catherine Magbanua had a previous relationship, on again, off again, with Sigfredo Garcia.
Alfredo.
They learned that Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua shared 2 children together. They had their connection. The problem is, that's where the state began to guess.
I know, right?
Began to make assumptions.
Crazy.
And you will see, we will show it, that those assumptions didn't make sense. Now, I love jigsaw puzzles.
Here we go with the puzzle
I
pieces.
love them since I'm young. The reason why I love them is because they only work if every piece fits. No matter what you do with the jigsaw puzzle, if a piece doesn't fit, it becomes a mess. You can't hammer it, and you can't ignore it. Because if you ignore it, you have holes in the puzzle. What you're going to see is with regards to this case,
Hi, Kane.
that's exactly what the state tried to do. They heard things, they saw things, but there were problems. They couldn't fit all the pieces together under their theories that they told you about today. I'm going to show you how those puzzles, those pieces, they didn't fit. They don't fit. And why? Respectfully, the state does not know what happened on July 18, 2014. On that day, 2 crimes occurred.
Yep. There they are.
The first one, the state knows about, and that was the brutal, heinous murder of Professor Markel. The other one, they don't know about. They're about to find out like you, because that day would forever change Charlie Adelson's life. But before we get there, I like cliffhangers. It's important to give you some background and timeline. Here.
Why is this all about him? I like cliffhangers. I like puzzles. I like puzzles.
Charlie Adelson is 46 years old, single with a young son. He grew up in South Florida, in Coral Springs in Broward County. His father was a dentist, a local dentist.
Named Prentice?
It wasn't the Adelson Institute when Charlie was growing up. It was a small dental practice with his dad. Charlie is the middle child of 3. He is very close with his parents. As they said, he is very close with his mom. Growing up, the family was middle class. And Charlie was not particularly close with either of his siblings. He grew closer with Wendi as they got older.
Bible.
He went to college at the University of Central Florida, went to dental school in South Florida, and then periodontic school. When he graduated as a periodontist, he had an idea. Rather than work in his own practice, he figured that he could travel around to dental practices all over South Florida. He would be a traveling periodontist. So what you are going to learn in this case is that Charlie Adelson had practices from the very south of South Florida to as far places as Jupiter. He was in the car sometimes for hours in a day.
He could travel in space.
And he worked a lot. You're going to see that. He was a workaholic. He spent a lot of time in that car. And what did he do when he was in the car to pass the time? He spoke a lot on the phone. He would talk to whoever would listen to him. And you're going to see in this case,
His mom mostly,
this is
right?
one thing we won't deny. Charlie Adelson likes to talk. And he likes to repeat himself. And who would he speak with the most? He'd speak with his girlfriend. He'd speak with his mom. He'd speak with his friends. Now, Wendi Adelson who's a state witness,
Fivel.
followed a different path. She went to a prestigious university in Boston. She then went to school in England on a Truman Fellowship, and later went to law school.
Cinnamon roll, yum.
She got scholarships for law school and college. Soon after starting law school, she met Dan Markel, and they fell in love. They got married. They ultimately moved to Tallahassee, where they both worked for FSU. Professor Markel as a law professor of the law school. Charlie Adelson didn't have much to do with either Professor Markel or Wendi during their marriage or before their marriage. He would talk to his sister periodically, maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks. They lived in Tallahassee for years. Charlie Adelson visited him in Tallahassee 2, maybe 3 times. Charlie loved his sister. He sought advice from her, as she did with him every once in a while. But they weren't super close. They were brother sister. The truth is that Charlie Adelson was a little self-centered. He was building his career. See, that traveling periodontist, in the beginning, it wasn't that successful. But by the time of this case, in the 2013-2014 time period, you're going to see that Charlie Adelson was making a lot of money. His practice was booming. He was working 6, sometimes 7 days a week. You'll see it on the wires. You'll see it in text messages. He would start his day early in the morning, and most days he wouldn't get home till 8, 9, 10 at night. At the time when this murder occurred, he was not married. He had no kids. He had a lot of money. And he was living a very good life. Now, in 2012, Wendi Adelson, on a trip down to South Florida, confides in her brother that she was having problems in her marriage.
Mm-hmm.
She told Charlie that she and Professor Markel had been going through marriage counseling. She asked him what he thought. He said, look, I want you to be happy, but you have to do what's best for you. I'm here to listen. Charlie had no involvement whatsoever in Wendy's decision to divorce Professor Markel. You'll hear that.
Well, who cares? Even
And in
if
September
he did, that's totally fine. That's not killing somebody.
of 2012, Wendi filed for divorce. And you're going to hear about how she filed for the divorce, and you're going to learn that Charlie had no involvement in her leaving the house, had nothing to do with him. But we got to talk about TVs.
Oh boy.
And you're going to hear a lot about TVs in this case.
Uh-huh. It is.
Excuse me.
Oh, it just gets worse. It just gets worse. Wait for the double extortion theory.
See, Charlie has a really bad history of telling bad jokes.
Oh boy.
So when Wendi left the house, his mom told him that she didn't have a TV. He asked her, he said, what can I do to help Wendi? She's moved to a new place. She's left most of the stuff behind. What can I do to help?
Oh, she took fucking everything.
His mom said, she doesn't have a TV. He said, okay, when you go to Tallahassee, go to Best Buy,
Oh boy.
buy a TV for Wendi, and I'll pay you for it. And so Wendi got the TV, and she called Charlie. This is back in 2012. The murder's in 2014. And she thanked him for the TV. And he didn't say he looked into hiring a hitman. He joked, a bad joke. And he said it was cheaper than hiring a hitman. Now, not only was it a bad joke, but you're going to hear in this trial, Charlie repeated the joke.
Mm-hmm.
He repeated it a lot to a lot of people. You're going to hear that he repeated it as late as March of 2014. So the man that they think hired a hitman is joking to others about hiring a hitman. Puzzle pieces. And you're going to learn why his repeating of that joke is going to be so important. I'm going to tell you in a little bit. Keep in the back of your mind.
Oh God.
But let's first go back to the divorce. The divorce was bitter. It was emotional. Wendi Adelson and Professor Markel, they'd have good times. But when things were bad, they would fight about everything. And in January 2013, Wendi Adelson filed a motion to relocate to South Florida with her 2 boys. That motion was opposed by Professor Markel. Now, what you're going to learn in this trial is that Wendi Adelson never thought that motion would be granted. Her lawyer told her that motion would never be granted. But she said, let's give it a shot. Charlie had very little to do with the motion. He knew she was filing it. He knew she didn't have much chance of getting it. And the motion was denied. When it was denied, it didn't change Charlie Adelson's life one bit. But unlike Charlie, his mom and dad were upset. They were upset because their daughter had a job opportunity in South Florida. She had no family support in Tallahassee, and they wanted her home. And you will see that Donna and Harvey Adelson are very involved in their children's lives. We won't run away from that. You will see that Donna Adelson and Harvey came up with a lot of crazy ideas. I mean, crazy ideas. You're going to see them. You've heard about some of them. When they show you those crazy ideas, take a look if any of them includes murder. Doesn't. Take a look at any of those crazy ideas include anything illegal. It doesn't. Take a look at if they're actually then go to lawyers to make sure that their ideas are legal. Murderers. You heard it. Unindicted co-conspirators going to lawyers to make sure that what they're offering is allowed. You're going to see that. But the ideas were crazy. You're going to read the emails, a lot of emotion. A mother-in-law, a grandmother with a lot of emotion. And you're going to see that Wendi Adelson, she rejected them. She rejected the ideas. They were never presented to Dan Markel. And then you're going to see that there was another idea. They have mentioned it in their opening, but they don't understand the importance of it. See, at one point in time, Donna Adelson and Harvey Adelson came with an idea to pay Professor Markel $1 million to allow their daughter to relocate. And they went to Charlie, who frankly by this point in time had more money than them. And they said, will you lend your sister $350,000? She'll pay you back or we'll pay you back. And he said, sure. And you're going to see that they presented this idea to Wendi Adelson. And the idea wasn't to take the boys out of Professor Markel's life. The idea was that with $1 million, if Professor Markel agreed, he could live in South Florida and commute back and forth to Tallahassee. He could work out his schedule. He didn't teach every day of the week. He could work out his schedule so that he could still teach at the university and go back and forth. You're going to see that Wendi Adelson never made that offer. But it's very important. Like the joke, I want you to put it in your back of your mind for now.
Got a new command.
Let's fast forward to October 2013.
Got a new command.
October 2013, Charlie started dating Catherine Magbanua. We'll call her Katie.
Mm-hmm.
She was beautiful. She was smart. Like Charlie, she graduated from UCF. She was hardworking. He met her in one of the dental practices. At first, the relationship was casual. They wanted it that way. Charlie particularly liked it and liked Katie
The mouse is
because she had 2 children. He worked a lot. His priority was his job. And Katie didn't bother him a lot. He only saw her like once, maybe twice a week. That's what he liked.
You need to add a binder.
She was smart. She was fun. And he treated her very well. And that was very different, you'll learn, from how she was treated previously. Now, you'll hear that he spent a lot of time with Katie over the months that they dated. And remember how I told you Charlie talks a lot and repeats himself a lot? Well, when they were together, he did just that. He talked about his day. He talked about what was going on in the world. He talked about his family, which, by the way, was a constant topic every single day. Because when Charlie's driving in the car every morning for an hour to work and an hour home, sometimes longer, he talked to his mom on the phone. And when he talked to his mom on the phone, what would be a topic of heavy conversation quite frequently? Wendy's divorce. All the problems in the divorce. They told you that. They told you that in opening. And what would Charlie do? He would tell these things to his girlfriend. And what were some of the things he told her? Well, he told her about the $1 million offer. He told her that he could pay it in cash. She said, that's a lot of money. He said, no, I have it in cash, and I'm going to get it back. He told her several times the joke. Over time, you're going to see through text messages that Katie wanted a deeper relationship. And you'll see that Charlie didn't want that. You'll also learn, and the timeline is important. They meet in September. They start dating in October of 13.
Here we go.
You're going to see that over time, it takes a couple months. Charlie starts to learn a little bit more about Katie's ex, Sigfredo Garcia. And what you're going to learn is that Charlie Adelson never meets Sigfredo Garcia officially.
Alfredo.
But by all counts, he was not a good guy. Violent. Long criminal history. Sigfredo Garcia and Katie had been high school boyfriend, girlfriend. And Katie was the love of Sigfredo's life. He lived for her. And you're going to see that Sigfredo Garcia hated Charlie Adelson. Puzzle pieces. So let me repeat it.
There it is.
You saw their chart. The shooter of Professor Markel, the man who murdered him, hated Charlie Adelson, according to them, his co-conspirator. And you're going to hear, not from our witnesses, from their own witnesses, that he wanted to kill Charlie Adelson. You're going to hear that in March of 2014,
Oh my God.
just 7 or 8 weeks before that first attempt of murder that they talk about,
Ugh.
he tried to kill him.
No, that's not
Puzzle
true.
pieces.
Oh my God. No.
You're also going to hear about a phone call on July 1, 2014. You're going to actually hear that July 1, 2014 call is how they found these guys. It's actually the craziest fact in this entire case, and there's a lot of crazy facts.
That is true.
You're going to hear that on July 1, 2014, Sigfredo Garcia made a call to the cell phone number of Harvey Adelson. It's the only call that helped investigators connect these folks to the Adelsons in the beginning. It actually broke the case. What they don't know, what you're going to see, it's in text messages. It's discussed on the wires. They don't know it because they don't understand it because they weren't there. Is that on July 1st, 2014, just 3 weeks or so after the first murder attempt. And by the way, just 17 days before the murder. Let me repeat that. The murder happens on July 18, 2014. On July 1st, 2014, Sigfredo Garcia tries to run Charlie off the road. He threatens him.
That's the jet ski day.
And what you're going to hear is that on July 1, he's so upset that he calls the Adelson Institute. He doesn't realize that Charlie isn't the doctor at the Adelson Institute. He just comes in and out of the place. So he gets their voicemail machine. And you know how dentists are? They say in an emergency, call a cell phone number, take your call at home on the cell phone number. What he hears in an emergency, call Dr. Adelson at such and such number. He thinks he's calling Charlie Adelson, but he calls Harvey Adelson. And he calls him and he threatens him. He tells him, if you keep dating Katie, we're going to go mano y mano. I'm going to kill you.
That's not in evidence. I guess
17 days
from testimony.
before, according to them, he conspired with this man to kill Professor Markel. Puzzle pieces.
Oh my God. Again, with the puzzle pieces.
What you're going to learn is that in the spring of 2014, it became apparent to Katie that her dreams of financial security with Charlie were not going to work out. You will learn that Katie heard the hitman joke. You will learn that she heard the $1 million offer and she got some ideas in her head.
Oh boy, here we go.
The state itself has called.
I'll back it up. We're about to get into the double extortion. This is where it gets insane.
That her dreams of financial security with Charlie were not going to work out. You will learn that Katie heard the hitman joke. You will learn that she heard the $1 million offer and she got some ideas in her head. The state itself has called Catherine Magbanua the mastermind. And that's exactly what she was. So now let's get to July 18th. I kept you waiting long enough.
Did I go back far enough for the gesture, Heather?
The June attempt didn't happen because Rivera didn't want to kill Dan Markel when his boys were around. See, what you're going to learn is during that June attempt, on June 4th, 5th, Professor Markel had custody of the boys. You're going to learn that Professor Markel and Wendi Adelson.
Prices. I'll go back. I want to see the gesture because this is these are short anyway. We're almost finished with him when he says prices. Let's see if this is.
He threatens him. And what you're going to hear is that on July 1, he's so upset that he calls the Adelson Institute. He doesn't realize that Charlie isn't the doctor at the Adelson Institute. He just comes in and out of the place. So he gets their voicemail machine. And you know how dentists are? They say in an emergency, call a cell phone number.
Good night,
Take your call at home on the cell phone number. What he hears in an emergency, call Dr. Adelson at such and such number. He thinks he's calling Charlie Adelson, but he calls Harvey Adelson.
Oh.
And he calls him and he threatens him. He tells him, if you keep dating Katie, we're going to go mano y mano. I'm going to kill you. 17 days before, according to them, he conspired with this man to kill Professor Markel. Puzzle pieces. What you're going to learn is that in the spring of 2014, it became apparent to Katie
gesture like putting puzzle pieces together.
that her dreams of financial security with Charlie were not going to work out. You will learn that Katie heard the hitman joke. You will learn that she heard the $1 million offer and she got some ideas in her head. The state itself has called Catherine Magbanowa the mastermind. And that's exactly what she was. So now let's get to July 18th. I kept you waiting long enough. The June attempt didn't happen because Rivera didn't want to kill Dan Markel when his boys were around. See, what you're going to learn
He's Jewish.
is during that June attempt on June 4th, 5th,
It's a Jewish puzzle. Professor
Markel had custody of the boys. You're going to learn that Professor Markel and Wendi Adelson shared custody 50-50. But you're going to learn that the state thinks Wendi Adelson was involved with her brother in a murder for hire, and she chose for the killers to kill her ex-husband when he had custody of her kids. Puzzle pieces.
Oh my God, again.
So you're going to learn that Luis Rivera was a bad guy.
God.
He had some conscience somewhere. He didn't want to do it in front of the kids. So they came back. By the way, on July 18th, who had custody of the kids when the murder actually happened? Professor Markel. You're going to hear he dropped them off at school. But this family who did this so that their grandchildren could be with them were going to risk for two hired hitmen to go up when he had custody of the kids. Puzzle pieces.
Oh my God. I forgot he said it this much.
July 18th for Charlie starts as a normal day. He works. You're going to see he lives in Fort Lauderdale. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with South Florida, so I'm going to give you a little bit of geography lesson.
Oh God.
He lives in Fort Lauderdale. That day, he's working in two offices because he'd often work in two offices a day. He'd work in the morning at one place and the afternoon at another. So he's working in two offices. The first office he's working in, both of them actually, are in Jupiter, Florida. Now, if you're familiar with South Florida,
He goes all the way to space.
Fort Lauderdale and Jupiter are not close.
You have to take
With
a
South Florida traffic,
rocket ship to get there.
in the morning, he was in the car for at least 2 hours. Now, he came home late that night, you're going to hear, so traffic was a little bit better, but it's probably still an hour to an hour and a half. Jupiter is north of Palm Beach. When I drive up here and I hit Jupiter, I know I'm about a third of the way here. That's a good way to look at it. If you live in Fort Lauderdale, when you hit Jupiter, you're 1/3 done. He's in the car and he's talking on the phone. And you're going to see it. We're going to show you what the phone calls are about. He talks to his sister,
Bible.
talks to his mom, talks to his girlfriend. We'll talk to you about it. There are phone calls. You're going to see it. There are a lot of phone calls. And there are a lot of phone calls to his girlfriend. And there are a lot of phone calls to his mom. We're not going to deny that. And he works in these two offices. And at around 6 o'clock, you'll see a text message that he's about to start a very long surgery, a big procedure. By the way, the text messages throughout the day are normal. just after 7 p.m., he gets a call from his mom. And he's told that Professor Markel has been shot. And he's shocked. He's upset. His first reaction is, Wendi and the boys okay? He's supposed to have dinner originally with a friend that night. But earlier in the day, that changes. And he's supposed to have dinner with Katie. And you're going to hear that Katie and him had gotten in a fight a couple days earlier about dinners. You'll hear it. And what you'll learn is after he finds out what happened, tells Katie he doesn't want to go to dinner. He leaves the office at around 8 o'clock in Jupiter. And you'll learn that Katie tells him she'll come to his house that night to comfort him. He shook up. Now, let me be clear. You're going to hear he wasn't close with Professor Markel. They weren't friends. They had nothing in common. So he shook up because someone he knew, the father of his nephews, had been shot.
Oh my God.
When Katie arrived that night, and you're going to learn more details of how she gets there, what she has to do to get there. It's not planned. You're going to see that. The state's going to put on that evidence. You're going to learn that she's scrambling to get a babysitter. You're going to learn, by the way, that Charlie had seen her for lunch the day before. So if it's a murder for hire, why didn't she get the money then? Puzzle pieces. You're going to learn that she gets there that night, sometime after 11. And when she gets there, she is frantic. She's upset. And he's scared because he's never seen her this way. And she sits him down and she tells him something terrible has happened. She says that a friend of hers had shot Professor Markel. She tells him over and over that she had nothing to do with it. But these people, she was talking too much. And her friend and these people learned about the problems that his family was having with Professor Markel.
Oh my God, this is where it gets crazy.
They learned about the $1 million offer. And they got it in their minds to do this. As you can imagine, Charlie.
Let me rewind that so you guys can hear it. This is the whole thing. Oh dear.
She tells him over and over that she had nothing to do with it. But these people, she was talking too much. And her friend and these people learned about the problems that his family was having with Professor Markel. They learned about the $1 million offer. And they got it in their minds to do this. As you can imagine, his life has just forever been altered. He asked, who are these people? She won't tell him. It's not safe for you to know.
Oh my God.
Screaming at her. She won't tell him. Charlie had a guess. You will hear in detail what happened that night. You will learn that Charlie Adelson was told if he didn't pay within the next 48 hours, he or one of his family members would be next. You will learn that Katie repeatedly said that she had nothing to do with it and acted distraught. You will hear how she said that she would help him. You will learn about the initial payment. It wasn't $100,000. It was more than $100,000. He took out everything he had in his safe. You're going to learn about that. The state doesn't know it. It was more money. But you're going to learn he didn't have $350,000. So he had to pay every month.
Oh my God.
They don't know about that either. Payments every month. Does that sound like a murder for hire? Or does that sound like extortion? You're going to hear about these gifts. And you're going to learn that the gifts were just that. They were gifts. Because as time went on, he became more and more certain that Katie was not involved. He became more and more certain that she was helping him. And he wanted to keep her happy too because he needed her. He needed her help. And you will hear that the payments changed a couple months after the night of the extortion. 2 crimes. You'll hear that the payments changed and that Katie was put on the books of the Adelson Institute. Paper trail. They created a paper trail. Puzzles don't fit. Pieces of the puzzle don't fit.
Oh my God.
And you'll hear that in order to put her on the books, despite Katie telling him the night of July 18th, you can never talk about this with anyone. You can never talk on the phone about this. You can never talk about it in public. You can never talk about it anywhere because if they find out, they will kill you and your family. If they think the police are coming to you to talk to you, they will kill you. Look at what they did to Professor Markel. But you will hear that he told someone. He had to. told his mom.
Oh my God.
You'll learn that she was the bookkeeper for the Dental Institute. You'll learn why he had to tell her. You'll learn about those checks. They've never been able to understand, why are they so sequential? Why are they back and forth? You'll learn why.
Why are they back and forth? What does that even mean?
They talk about the bump in 2016. What I like to call is the second extortion.
Here we go.
What they don't realize is that their undercover operation was an extortion on an extortion.
Oh,
They don't know it.
there it
It's not
is.
their fault. And we're going to go through the wires with you. We're
Oh,
going to go
God.
through Dolce Vita with you.
Oh, God.
And we're going to show you how they actually prove his innocence.
Oh, my God.
We're going to show you how they are talking carefully. They're talking to him. He's talking about an extortion.
Oh, my God.
They're happy if this bump is the police, because if it's the police,
Sorry.
none of them are going to get killed.
What? Oh, God.
If it's a bad guy, they're in danger. If you do a murder with someone,
You do
the
it.
last person in the world you want this bump to be is the police, because it means they're onto you. Puzzle pieces.
Oh, my God. This jury is got to be lost right now.
Not from the first layer, she says, but from the second layer. I got goosebumps when she said it. It's one of my favorite lines in the recording.
Oh, my God.
Not from the first layer, the first extortion, but from the second layer. 20 months later is the bump. That's the second layer to Charlie Adelson at that point in time. You will also see, and what could be weird about this case, ladies and gentlemen, and you're going to start to see it today. Much of their case, I agree about. They're going to put witnesses up there. I'm not going to ask them one question. Some of their evidence is exactly the truth. It just doesn't prove a murder. The stapled money, it's his money.
Bro.
You will also see that Sigfredo Garcia was arrested on May 25, 2016. You will see that Luis Rivera was arrested on June 2nd, 2016. You will see that Catherine Magbanua was arrested on October 1, 2016. Guess who wasn't arrested? Charlie Adelson. He wasn't arrested for 6 more years. And what you're going to see is that they have the exact same evidence in 2016 against Charlie Adelson that they do today. The same liars. They talk about an enhanced Dolce Vita recording. You're going to get both recordings. You determine if you can hear anything better. See, the state's case against Charlie Adelson is a case of assumptions. It's a case of guesses. It was not brought until weeks before Katie Magbanua's trial. You can ask yourself why. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your attention.
Oh, boy.
I want to ask for your patience in this case. A man's life is in your hands. He's innocent. Send him home. Take your arm.
You charge them, sir.
So that's it for the opening statements, guys. We did it. There it is. There's your puzzle pieces. There's your double extortion. There it is. So what can we expect with Donna? Remember, she initially had Dan Rashbaum as her counsel. No longer is that the case. So who knows what to expect? Will she throw Wendi under the bus? Will she throw Charlie under the bus? What the hell will happen? Who knows? But this is the strategy they took here. Was it successful? No, was not successful. Certainly was not successful at all. And as we know, Dan Rashbaum has subsequently been in all kinds of trouble for all the conflict of interest and whatnot. So yeah, so there we go. So that's it. So that'll be it for this stream, guys. I'm really hoping some of those BK documents come out tomorrow. I would expect them to. So I would say more than likely we will be, you know, if things come out, we will be having a BK stream tomorrow. If actually, I guess regardless, because even if there's not any new docs, we still need to finish going over the order on Franks and like the order denying the motions to suppress. So if we don't get any new docs, we'll finish up with some of those other documents for BK. So either way, you're very welcome. Thanks you guys for being here as always. Yeah, Scroll Crew is the best. As I always say, I love you guys so much. And yeah, so other than that, that'll be it for this one, guys. Love y'all, and I'll see you guys next time.